I'm honored to be one of the 100 speakers to celebrate this 100-year birthday. Actually, I'm so honored that I put on my best pants. Those are 101 years today, as you can see from the tag in the back of them. I didn't want to show you the back. I am the director of the Center for Sustainable Communications, which is a center here at KTH with KTH and 6 partners. The City of Stockholm, Coop, Ericsson, Telia Company, the Stockholm County Council and Täby. And I think those kinds of corporations are something that we're quite good at here at KTH. I'm also a professor in environment and future studies here, which I will go back to also after next year when we put this center to history. Today's agenda during those 20 minutes, I will give you this. First, we will take a trip in time for about 200 years. I will then say a few words about future studies and then go on with something on digitalisation and environment, and finally wrap all this up to something that is hopefully some kind of interesting conclusion to all of you. If we start with the time travel. Welcome to Sweden 1850. The elementary school has just been introduced, but there is no public schooling for everyone, no universal right to vote. Sweden is a pre-industrial society with 3.5 million inhabitants, twice as many as 100 years ago. Stockholm is home to just under 100,000 inhabitants. It's difficult and heavy to obtain clean water, and to the extent there exist drains, they are very simple. The city's smell is strong. Season and clouds determine how dark it is in the streets at night. Cholera epidemics ravage the city at regular intervals. A technological institute established 23 years ago offers 2 years training. It's become 1900. Electricity has come to Sweden, but mainly to the industries. There are water pipes, sewer pipes, and water toilets, but hardly any wastewater treatment. Therefore, a rapid contamination of waterways around the city is underway. Railways are built through urban and rural areas. Stockholm is the most telephone-dense city. Urbanization has become evident. Stockholm has 300,000 inhabitants and Sweden 5 million, despite an emigration of 750,000 Swedes the last 50 years. Wealthy men and businesses have the right to vote. The Technological Institute has been renamed the Royal Institute of Technology, trains 125 students yearly and has enrolled its first female student. Another 50 years have passed. Welcome to bustling 1950s. Sweden is industrialized, has a huge economic growth, and has not taken part in 2 world wars. The service sector has grown. Stockholm is a city of stone buildings, and around the city a number of suburbs has appeared. Swedes has begun to have holidays. Many then go to the countryside. Society is characterized by consumption euphoria. There is not yet supermarkets, but the market trade has fallen sharply. Most homes have central heating, and the majority of households in Stockholm have radio and refrigerator, but no freezer. Travel is rapidly changing these years before mass car ownership and underground development. Stockholm has 750,000 inhabitants and Sweden 7 million. Married men and women are treated as equal according to the Marriage Act, and women are entitled to leave and some maternity pay during childbirth. 33 years ago, KTH was moved to a specially built campus here on Valhallavägen. Now it has become today. The Swedes have long become richer on average. The comfort revolution that began 150 years ago has continued even in the last decennia. Travel is 5 times larger than it was 65 years ago. Water, soil, and air are perceived as more or less clean. But it is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the global impact of consumption in the form of, for example, climate change. TV, computer, internet, and mobile phones are widespread phenomena. The fax machine has come and gone. Living area has doubled. Stockholm City has 900,000 inhabitants, and there has been a huge population growth in suburban municipalities, so that the county has doubled its population for the third 50-year period in a row. Parents are entitled to share parental leave between father and mother, and we celebrate 100 years of the KTH campus at Vallalavägen. So this little story, or trip through story, indicates that a lot of changes happens in a 50-year perspective. Then you can imagine that it's quite difficult to do future studies if the aim would be to actually predict the future. Fortunately, we have different approaches to future studies, and I tend to divide them into 3 different approaches responding to 3 different questions. One is predictive scenarios answering the question, what will happen? So that will be forecasts. The second is explorative scenarios, saying what can, or answering the question, what can happen? And then we have normative scenarios. How can a certain target be reached? The point of highlighting those 3 questions is that if you ask different questions, you can't expect to get the same answer. And this is sometimes a misunderstanding when you do normative scenarios and you don't get the same response as when you get predictive scenarios, But it is sad when you don't get the same response, because then you have problems. To put it a little bit rhetoric, if you only look for what you expect to happen, it will be difficult to change a negative path. Or should we aim at fulfilling predictions, or should we aim at fulfilling targets? And this is something you can think a little about. Future studies is often about environmental problems. And the reason for this is, of course, that we see so many serious threats to the environment coming up the coming 50 years or so. This is a graph from IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the by far most important body of researchers doing climate research. It shows reasons for concern, that is, changes in our ecosystem. And the figure illustrates the additional risks that come with increasing temperature for each reason for concern that you have down here. And as you can see, already today, we have some increased risks just because of the temperature increase we've seen. If we go up to the 2-degree target that is quite often mentioned, we see several very, very important risk increasements that we should avoid. And this is something that is really, really worrying. What this should look like is this. Had it looked like this, then we wouldn't have had to bother about climate change. Then it would have been undetectable increased risks for all those ecosystems. But this is unfortunately not the case. For me, then, coming from the environmental side and then starting to work with digitalisation, how could this be connected? Well, I will now go through 3 different approaches to digitalisation and environment. They are quite different, but they all have the same, in some way, starting point, connecting digitalisation and environment. The first is a couple of ways of reducing environmental impact through digitalisation. The second has to do with the 4-step principle for heated spaces. And the third with potentials and risks with sharing applications. Well, I will come to that when we go there. So first, if we look at the number of ways of reducing environmental impact through digitalization, we can think about substitution effects. I don't know how many of you have had an answering machine or even seen an answering machine. We don't have them anymore. They are in the cloud. We can think of how we can intensify the use of buildings or the use of vehicles through intelligent booking systems, for instance. We are not using this at all to the extent that should be possible. We can discuss improving, or we can look at how we can improve efficiency, which is not the same as intensification, because here it's more like the technical systems and the steering of, for instance, a building like this, so that we adjust the amount of oxygen for each moment depending on the number of people, or even forecasting that in advance. And then slightly different, you can need this you can inform a lot about environmental threats and about environmental effects of different consumption behavior, for instance. But last but not least, there is also through long-term changes of society when we can think how we build our societies and our cities quite differently through when we can do our activities through digitalization. The second relation between digitalization and environment will have to do with inefficient space use. This is important because there are so many things that we that could be better, and there are so many things that are bad with not using spaces efficiently. We use excess energy in building a lot of unnecessary buildings. We use excess energy just for heating the buildings that we just built. We get inefficient transport systems and service supply if we live too far away from each other, and we get less lively neighborhoods. Therefore, we have suggested a 4-step principle for floor spaces, which is directly taken from a 4-step principle in transport, if you've heard about that one. The idea is that when you're about to take a new investment decision, you should think about it in this way. First, try to see if you, instead of building new space, can reduce the need for space. This is what has happened already with bank offices, of course, where we have digital banks. In homes, bookshelves are taking less and less space, maybe not at my place. And the amount of shared belongings that we tend to store like this might be other better ways of storing or by sharing. If you can't reduce the need for space, then you can at least make more efficient use of space. And then there are different ways of matching space, available space with the need for space. And then only when you can't use this, then you can rebuild current buildings, and as a 4th step, invest in new buildings, considering the first 2 parts, of course. So that was the second of my 3 relations between environment and digitalization. The third is this very simple graph, and this is not the way it looks, but somehow we tend to perceive that we have, when we have a possibility to change something, we can see that there are either potentials or risks in this. But in practice, it looks like this. We have both potentials and risks with more or less anything we do. And that should be something that you think about when you make strategic policy decisions. So if you, for instance, look at potential for reducing energy use and risk for increased energy use, then there will be a lot of changes, a lot of things you can do that will be either good or bad, or have a potential or a risk for each of those. And then the strategy for each of those should be, if it is something down on the left corner here, then the idea would be that your policy can just neglect them, because there is either much of risk nor opportunity for that one. But on the other hand, if you find a change that would risk increasing energy use but has not much potential to decrease it, then that is something that you should actually try to counteract with your policies. And then, of course, if you have something with high potential, low risk, you should encourage it. But the really tricky thing is if you have things with both a high risk and a high potential. This is where policymakers should really focus, because then it's something else that you need to focus on. You need to put other measurements probably in order to take care of the potentials here and avoid the risks. Some examples of this connected to sharing economy could be, we have here sharing cities. Those, I just put 5, we have about 50 of them, I think. And here you can see, for instance, tool libraries, that is, or different kinds of sharing stuff that is discussed a lot in sharing discussions, in discussions on the sharing economy. It's not very much risk, not very much potential, simply because stuff is not one of the big energy users in society. On the other hand, if you look at traffic optimization and home rental applications or sharing services, there you have both very high risks and very high potential. The reason for this is that if we just optimize traffic, then we will be able to drive more. we will induce more traffic by just optimizing it. That's why it's a high risk. The high potential is that if we optimize traffic and at the same time put on measures that will avoid that we at the same time increase the traffic, then we can reduce energy use a lot that way. And it's the same with home rentals. Airbnb, for instance, gives us opportunities right now to live just bigger and bigger because we can get some extra incomes and we can afford it, which is, I don't know if you followed the discussion, but a big problem in many big cities such as Barcelona and San Francisco and Amsterdam. So what is the potential for digitalization to support environmental targets? Well, it's a very huge potential because digitalization can support low resource use in more or less any activity and sector that you can come up with. So that's fine. Unfortunately, you could also claim that there is a non-existence or even a negative potential if the solutions that we come up with are not combined with other measures. And the reason for this being that digitalization is so good at doing things more efficiently that it will also lead to more resource use if we don't combine the digitalization with other measures. Taking this back then to the little trip in history that I gave you, we saw that a lot of things can happen in 50 years. And I will now take you into 3 different stories of the future to see that different things can happen in the future. In life online first, here life online has become dominating with a very strong focus on online experiences and not so much focus is on the outdoor environment. Self-fulfillment and status is achieved online, and food and other necessities are usually delivered to homes, and goods consumption is low except for when it comes to ICT equipment. In controlled convenience, this is another future where the opportunities coming from data crunching is in focus. People live to high extent lives in the real world with high-tech support. In controlled convenience, people are entirely free from integrity and voluntarily they give up their own data for the sake of optimal convenience. And valued environment finally is a scenario where digitalization is used to support environmental targets. Data assessment and visualizations are used to inform and create efficient measures leading to fulfillment of the environmental targets. This changes consumption entirely towards services and away from goods. So what I wanted to illustrate with this 200-year trip is that a lot happens in 50 years and that the future will not look like today. When we come to looking at what the future will be like and what the effects of digitalization are, many different options are possible. In essence, this talk can be summarized in 2 conclusions related to the question of what are the effects of digitalization on the environment. And the first conclusion is, it depends. It's not a very popular conclusion to come from scientists, but the second conclusion is that the first conclusion, it depends, is a very strong and very promising conclusion because it means that the future is dependent on what we do and what decisions that we take. We can produce a good answer. Thank you.